Never did greatness manifest at such an early age as it did with our next famous subject, the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart is probably the best-known child prodigy in history, yet, unlike many child prodigies, his genius didn't wane as he aged. Instead, it grew and expanded, reaching its peak in the years before his death. The promise shown in the child was more than fulfilled in the works of the man. Today, Mozart is among the most respected and most prolific composers in history. To many, fans and critics alike, he is the greatest composer of all. His works, which include more than 600 compositions, marked a climax in musical history. He's considered the master of the late 18th century classical style that developed in Vienna, Austria. Mozart was also exceptionally versatile. He wrote in every musical genre of his time: opera, symphonies, concertos, sonatas. And in each genre, he combined beautiful sound and technical perfection. He also did more than any other composer to make the piano the popular instrument it is today. In Mozart's time, the piano was still fairly new and was played chiefly by amateurs. After he adopted it in his personal concerts and his compositions, it gained the serious attention of both the public and professionals. Mozart's talent with the piano, like most of his other talents, appeared at a phenomenally early age. By the time he was only 5 years old, it was apparent to all who knew him that he was a child of extraordinary destiny. Mozart was born in Salzburg, Austria, on January 27, 1756. His parents christened him Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Amadeus Mozart, but fortunately for the world, they decided early on to call him simply Wolfgang. This soon transformed into the affectionate family nickname Wulfrl. He himself would also sometimes use the name Amadeus, which means lover of God. Mozart's mother, Anna Maria Pertl, was from a middle-class family active in local administration. Mozart's father, a man who would have an enormous influence on his life and career, was also a talented musician. Leopold Mozart was the concertmaster of the court in Salzburg, a successful composer and violinist, and the author of a famous treatise on violin playing. He was exactly the right man to have a son like Wolfgang. He recognized and nurtured his boy's talents from the very start. That start seems to have occurred within only a few years after the child was born. There's a story that the Mozart family was visiting a farm when Wolfgang was only 2 years old, and that when the child heard a pig squeal, he exclaimed, "G sharp!" Someone ran to a piano in the farmhouse and confirmed it for all. G sharp was exactly right. As a child, Wolfgang liked to sit and watch his older sister, Anna Maria, practicing the clavier. Nannerl, as the family called her, was 5 years older than Wolfgang and somewhat of a prodigy in her own right. Her little brother adored her. He would listen to Nannerl playing, and when she finished, he would plop himself down at the keyboard and duplicate everything he'd heard. There's a note from Leopold in one of the family music books that says, "My little Wolfgangerl learned this piece 3 days before his 5th birthday, between 9 and 9:30 at night." Leopold taught Wolfgang to play the harpsichord when he was only 4. Next would come the organ and the violin. Wolfgang would stay up late at night practicing by candlelight. During the day, he insisted that all his play and activities be accompanied by music. By the age of 5, the child was already composing his own minuets. By the age of 9, he was composing symphonies, and by age 13, he was writing concertos and sonatas. He could read music before he could read words, and some stories say he hummed tunes before he could speak. Years later, when Mozart was an adult, it is said that he was approached by a youth who wanted his advice on writing a symphony. Mozart told the boy he was still very young and it might be better if he started out with something simple like a ballad. The youth protested, "But you wrote symphonies when you were only 10 years old." To which Mozart replied, "Yes, but I didn't have to ask how." Mozart was only 6 years old when his father decided the world should know about his remarkable son, so he arranged a tour of Europe for both Wolfgang and his sister Nannerl. There's been criticism over the role Leopold played in Mozart's life, that it was overly possessive, that it was exploitive, and fueled by the father's own ambitions for fame and success. Leopold, although unquestionably a strong and domineering figure, saw it differently. To him, Wolfgang was a gift, a wonder child placed in his charge by God himself. He felt a duty, in his mind a divine duty, to share this wonder with the world. He referred to Wolfgang once as the miracle which God let be born in Salzburg. As a child, at least, Wolfgang seemed to respect and love his father. He used to say, "God comes first, but right after God comes Papa." 2 weeks before Wolfgang's birthday, the entire family boarded a coach and set out to present the children to Europe. During this first tour, Mozart played at the royal court in Vienna for the Empress Maria Theresa and her husband, Emperor Francis I. Maria Theresa had 16 children of her own, and she was charmed by the Mozart children, especially when Wolfgang leaped into her arms and said, "I like you. You're nice." He was even more impulsive when he met the Empress' daughter, Marie Antoinette. He proposed. When Marie Antoinette consoled him after he'd slipped on the marble floors, the 6-year-old said, "You're good. When I grow up, I will marry you." Wolfgang played for the Empress on the piano, the violin, and the organ. Then she challenged him to play without being able to see the keyboard. The keyboard was covered with a cloth, and Wolfgang continued to play masterfully. When the Mozart children had finished their performance, the Empress had them dressed in silk and gold, and they spent the rest of the afternoon playing with the little princesses. Leopold was given 100 gold pieces, and then the family set out for London, where they'd been invited to perform for the King and Queen of England. "Everything is going to turn out fine," said Leopold, "as long as God keeps an eye on my Wuffel's health." As a child, Wolfgang had been ill so often that his family and doctors feared that he might not survive childhood. In England, Wolfgang played 6 sonatas for piano and flute for Her Majesty, Queen Charlotte, sonatas he had written himself. By now, the European press had nicknamed the 2 Mozart children wonders of nature. About 2 years into the tour, when Wolfgang was about 8, both he and Nannerl fell ill. The doctors gave up hope for their survival, but Leopold lit candles and prayed to God to spare their lives, taking care to remind God that Wolfgang was unique in all the world. Both children recovered and soon were back on the road. During his first European tour, which lasted 3 years, Mozart visited all the music centers of Europe: Munich, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Mannheim, Mainz, Frankfurt, Brussels, Paris and Versailles, London, The Hague, Amsterdam, Lyon, and Switzerland. In all these places, Wolfgang and Nannerl played at courts, in public, or in churches. In London, Wolfgang was befriended by the composer Johann Christian Bach, the famous composer's youngest son, and under his influence, Wolfgang composed his first symphonies. While in Paris, he published his first works, including the sonatas he'd written and performed for the Queen of England. From all his tours and travel, Wolfgang would eventually learn to speak 15 languages. Back home in Salzburg again, Wolfgang continued to write. While he worked, he always wore a white apron to protect his velvet coats and lace ruffles. In 1768, when he was 12, he wrote his first opera, which was scheduled to be performed in Vienna. Although that performance was canceled, it was performed the following year at Salzburg. The same year his first opera debuted, Wolfgang and his father set out on another tour. This time, Mozart's mother and sister stayed at home, while father and son headed across the Alps to Italy. It was a noteworthy trip. While he was in Rome, the Pope conferred the Order of the Golden Spur on Wolfgang during a private audience. Wolfgang also wrote another opera and developed a deeper understanding and appreciation of Italian music, which would influence his future writing. Wolfgang also created a sensation when he was able to write Don Allegri's Miserere from memory after only one hearing. In the next 2 years, he would make 2 more journeys to Italy, and he wrote an opera on each trip. Wolfgang regularly wrote home to his sister, whom he missed badly. When he returned, he brought back a prayer he'd written just for her. In spite of the attention and coddling he received, Wolfgang was said to be a very sweet and kind child, and unusually sensitive. As much as he loved music, he was frightened of the sound of a trumpet. Throughout his travels, he always mailed home little notes to his dog Bimperl. Wolfgang loved animals. In London, he once interrupted a concert to run after a cat who'd wandered in. He owned pets throughout his life, including a variety of dogs, a pet grasshopper, and various birds. After Wolfgang returned to Salzburg, the archbishop of the city died and was replaced by a new one. This was enormously significant to the Mozarts. The archbishop was the ruler of the province. He was also, of course, the ruler of the church, and in the 18th century, the church and religious music provided employment for composers. The first Archbishop of Salzburg, von Schrattenbach, had always admired the Mozarts. He had appointed Leopold concertmaster and had always encouraged the musical talents of Leopold's children. But now there was a new archbishop, Hieronymus von Colloredo. Colloredo's view of musicians was that they were servants, not much different from the coachman or the valet. Although he was first sympathetic to the Mozarts and appointed Wolfgang concertmaster, he became quickly irritated by what he perceived to be the young man's stubbornness. He was also annoyed by Wolfgang's absences when he toured or gave concerts. Colloredo discouraged lavish music and set severe limits on mass music, which Mozart objected to. Mozart grew increasingly unhappy and restless. Nevertheless, he managed to compose a large number of both sacred and secular works during this period, for only a nominal fee. Frustrated and bored, he finally decided to seek a better position outside of Salzburg. In 1777, when he was 21 years old, he set out for Germany and France. In Germany, Mozart was unable to find a position, but he did find a romance. The woman's name was Aloysia Weber, and she was the second of 4 daughters of a music copyist. He wrote to his father with a plan. He would like to travel with the Webers to Italy. Leopold's response was swift and forceful. "Off with you to Paris, and soon find your place among great people." It was during this trip, and partly because of his romance, that the relationship between Mozart and his father began to change. Mozart was beginning to assert his independence, and his letters reflect the beginnings of defiance. But he was still not strong enough to resist his father's command to continue to France, and so off he went. This time he was accompanied by his mother, whom Leopold had sent along as a chaperone. It was a fateful decision. In France, Mozart wrote the well-known Paris Symphony, but by the time of its premiere, his mother had taken seriously ill. She died 2 weeks later, and Mozart wrote to an abbé friend in Salzburg to break the news to his father. His mother gone, and no hopes of finding a position in Paris, he returned to Germany, only to find that the ardor of his young lover had cooled. Aloysia had already found a new suitor. Mozart returned to Salzburg alone. In Salzburg, Mozart was given the position of court organist. He wrote a series of beautiful church pieces, including the famous Coronation Mass, and he received a commission to compose a new opera from the city of Munich. Then, in 1781, he was summoned to Vienna by the Archbishop, who was there celebrating the accession of a new emperor, Joseph II. Suddenly, after months of mixing with aristocrats in Germany and France, Mozart found himself once again being treated only slightly better than the Archbishop's cook. To make matters worse, the Archbishop refused to let him play at concerts, including one attended by the new emperor. The fee for the one concert alone would have equaled his average yearly salary. They argued violently, and Wolfgang asked to be dismissed from service. He had no regrets. Instead, he settled in Vienna and prepared for a very promising independent career with the blessing of the emperor. During this time in Vienna, Mozart connected with 2 people who would be most dear to him throughout his life. One was the great composer Joseph Haydn, who would become a lifelong friend and a source of much musical inspiration. There's a famous story about a bet Mozart once made with Haydn. He wagered a case of champagne that the older man couldn't play at sight a piece Mozart had just composed. Haydn took the bet. The music sheet was placed on the spinet rack. Haydn skillfully played the first few bars, and then he abruptly stopped. The composition required that he play with each hand at a different end of the keyboard, while also striking a note in the middle. Haydn admitted defeat. Then Mozart took his place at the piano and, reaching the impossible note, bent forward and hit it with his nose. There were cheers and applause from the onlookers. The other important connection Mozart made in Vienna this time was with Constanze Weber, sister of Mozart's old flame Aloysia. When he left the services of the Archbishop, Mozart went to live with the Webers, for although Aloysia had married, he had remained friends with her and with the rest of her family. That summer, rumors began to crop up that Mozart was in love with the 3rd daughter, Constanze, and was considering marriage. Leopold wrote to Wolfgang, demanding an explanation. Wolfgang responded that the rumors were false, that he had never thought less of getting married, and that he wasn't in love with Constanze. He then moved out of the Weber house to help end the gossip, and then, 6 months later, he he wrote to his father for his blessing in marriage. Now he was in love with Constanze, and furthermore, he had already committed himself to her. Leopold didn't send his blessing, but Mozart married anyway in early 1782. Constanze was a plain woman, but playful like Mozart. He called her by a variety of nicknames, including Little Mouse, My Little Pigeon, Stanzerl, or Stanzi. In many ways, this superb genius, and most famous of child prodigies, had remained childlike throughout his life. He liked pranks and practical jokes. He could be silly and unsophisticated. A friend who'd known him for many years said she had never once heard him say anything serious. The newlyweds visited Salzburg, where Mozart worked on his great Mass in C minor, which was destined to remain unfinished. Mozart wrote music more quickly than any composer in history, and he worked on a fairly regimented schedule. He arose at 6 and composed until 9. Then he gave music lessons until lunchtime. Then, unless there was a concert to attend, he worked late into the night. He was able to get by on only 4 hours sleep. If he had to work through the night to meet a deadline, Constanze would keep him awake by telling him fairy tales. He was famous for the seemingly casual way he recorded his musical ideas. He would jot them down during meals, while visiting with friends, even while playing pool. It's said that while he held Constanze's hand during the birth of their child, he was writing music with the other hand. When the couple returned to Vienna, Mozart was commissioned to write the opera The Abduction from the Seraglio for the court opera. It was this opera that evoked the now legendary review of Emperor Joseph, who said, "Very many notes, my dear Mozart." Although he no longer received the publicity he did as a child prodigy, he was still a brilliant performer, and he never stopped composing. He became less of a novelty and more of a serious artist. He gave numerous concerts, all of them successful. He had once written to his father that Vienna was the land of the piano, and his greatest success there was as a pianist-composer. In one 5-week period, he appeared at 22 concerts. He also began to keep a catalog of his music, and he composed furiously. One sonata was written in such haste that he had no time to write out the piano part. At the premiere, he played from a blank sheet of paper. He also gave music lessons. None of this generated enough income to support him, but that's chiefly because he aspired to a lifestyle beyond his means. Mozart's income was probably higher than that of most musicians, but still below that of the elite levels of society with which he identified. His entire life, Mozart had been instructed by his father to be friendly with the aristocracy and remain aloof from other musicians. Wolfgang had developed the tastes of the aristocracy whose favor he so diligently sought, but he could never achieve the income to match it. In 1784, Mozart joined the Freemasons. He would remain a member until he died. He would sometimes write compositions for their meetings, and Masonic traditions and beliefs occasionally appeared in his work, particularly in The Magic Flute, a fairy tale opera he wrote in the last months of his life. In 1786, he wrote his greatest Viennese success, the opera entitled The Marriage of Figaro. He also wrote his great piano concertos and string quartets, which he dedicated to his dear friend Joseph Haydn. In 1787, when he was 31, the emperor hired him as court composer at a modest salary. By now, Mozart's works were in great demand, but the Viennese public was fickle, and soon his popularity would begin to fade. After Figaro, Mozart's favor at court started to wane. The court grew nervous about his revolutionary ideas, first expressed in Figaro through the negative portrayal of a lecherous nobleman, and expressed again later in Don Giovanni. In addition, Mozart's new musical style was not understood by many. It was too deep, too complex. He sank into debt and had to write to a brother Freemason for a loan. In 1787, Mozart heard his father was seriously ill, and he wrote him a letter in which he described the Masonic view of death as this best and truest friend of mankind. A month later, Leopold died. As always, Mozart continued to work. After Figaro, he concentrated on the opera Don Giovanni for Prague, a city where he was especially appreciated. This was followed by the opera Così fan tutte, and then, in the following year, The Magic Flute, which was produced by a small theater in Vienna. It was during this period of financial stress that Mozart composed his last 3 and perhaps greatest symphonies, E-flat, G minor, and the Jupiter Symphony in C. He wrote all 3 in a period of only 7 weeks. He He also wrote a superb series of string quintets. The debts continued to mount, although the Mozarts were always able to keep their servants and a hired coach. However, Mozart began to suffer severe depressions around this time and wrote of his black thoughts. He's now considered, as many other geniuses are, to be a manic depressive who alternated between periods of deep gloom and frenzied activity. Yet, when he was working, he was always at his happiest. He once said, "What a delight this is, I cannot tell. All this inventing, this producing, takes place in a pleasing, lively dream." Then in 1791, when he was ill and had taken to bed, Mozart received a visitor, a very peculiar visitor. A man in dark gray clothing appeared at the door and offered a commission for Mozart to write a requiem, a mass for the dead. The man said only that Mozart's client wished to remain anonymous and that the project must be completed in secrecy. Mozart, who had always been superstitious, became convinced the requiem was for himself. He labored hard on the piece, all the while tortured by thoughts of the supernatural and the belief that his death was imminent. Meanwhile, Constanze was away much of the time, taking a cure in Baden. In July, she gave birth to their sixth child, one of two who survived. During this period, the Mozarts were as poor as they had ever been. A friend who visited found them dancing together in great abandonment and asked what the occasion was. Laughingly, they told him they were simply trying to keep warm because they were out of firewood. The gray-suited man returned several times to pester Mozart about finishing the requiem, and Mozart developed a terrible dread of his visits. Meanwhile, he worked on the requiem while simultaneously working on his opera, The Magic Flute. The Magic Flute was finished. The requiem was not. Mozart died at midnight on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35. There were rumors that he had been poisoned and that his death was a conspiracy on the part of Antonio Salieri, the Italian concertmaster at court. This is very unlikely. Mozart and Salieri had a polite and cordial relationship, and in spite of popular fiction, were not enemies. It's believed instead that Mozart died from kidney failure, possibly complicated by malnutrition. He was given a cheap funeral at St. Stephen's Cathedral and was buried in an unmarked grave at the cemetery of St. Mark's in the Viennese suburbs. There was a heavy snowfall that day, and friends who had come to escort the coffin fled one by one. The fact that the beloved musical genius was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave has been exaggerated over the years. In truth, such burials were required for all Viennese, except aristocrats. One of Mozart's students went on to finish the incomplete requiem. It was discovered later that it had been commissioned by an eccentric nobleman who often hired well-known composers to write work he could later claim was his own in private performances. Nevertheless, it had, as Mozart feared, proved to be the harbinger of his death. Mozart's life was short, but it was phenomenally productive. His work was broad and versatile. In spite of the difficulties of his life, his music is often cheerful, energetic, and even humorous. Yet he could also be serious, and often he would be both at one time. Operas like Don Giovanni were a complex blend of light and dark, serious and fun. Don Giovanni is one of 22 operas Mozart wrote, many of which gained wide recognition both before and after his death. Today, the best and most popular are considered to be The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, both written in Italian, and The Magic Flute, which was written in German. These three great works placed Mozart with Richard Wagner and Giuseppe Verdi as the holy trinity of opera composers. Each of Mozart's operas contains arias, songs for single voices, recitative ensembles, rapidly sung dialogue by two or more characters, and choruses. Mozart's operas are known especially for the way he handled complex emotions within a unified musical piece. He gave real personality to the characters in opera, which until then had been mere cardboard figures. In addition to opera, Mozart wrote over 40 symphonies, many of which are still performed today. His later symphonies are the most popular. They're usually about 20 to 30 minutes long, with 4 movements or sections. His last and most famous symphony was called Number 41, but was later nicknamed Jupiter, perhaps because of its monumental power.